The wind in this town was a bully. It came howling down from the barren hills with nothing to stop it, stealing the warmth from a man's coat and kicking up dust that stung the eyes. It was the kind of wind that made you want to hunker down by a fire, but today it had whipped the townsfolk into a frenzy, gathering them in the main square like vultures drawn to a carcass. I was only there for flour and salt, but the noise pulled me in. A crowd had formed a tight, hungry circle around a makeshift platform, just a few rough-hewn planks laid across a pair of barrels. On top of that platform stood a man I knew by sight, Jedediah. He was a loud, mean drunk, and today he was reeking of cheap whiskey and desperation. But it wasn't him the crowd was staring at. It was the woman and the little boy beside him. Mean, his wife, Elara, and their son. $1, Jedediah slurred, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of the afternoon. He held up a single grubby finger. $1 for the pair! She's a good worker, and the boy, well, he's small, but he'll grow. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock, pity, and a dark, ugly flicker of interest. I felt a cold knot tighten in my gut. I'd seen a lot of desperation on this frontier, but this was a new kind of low. Selling your own flesh and blood like livestock. I watched the boy, Leo, who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. He was a shadow clinging to his mother's leg, his small face buried in the folds of her worn-out dress. He was trembling, a tiny leaf in a gale, but the woman, she wasn't trembling. Elara stood as straight as a winter pine, her hands resting on the swell of her pregnant belly. There were no tears on her face, no screams caught in her throat. Her expression was one of quiet, terrifying stillness. She wasn't looking at Jedediah or the leering faces in the crowd. Her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond us all, as if she had already witnessed the very worst the world had to offer, and this was just a final, weary postscript. In her eyes, I saw a resilience so profound it looked like exhaustion. It was the look of a person who had been broken so many times, she'd learned to fashion her pieces back into a shield. Something inside me, a part of me I thought had died with my Martha, began to stir. I thought of my own quiet, empty cabin. I thought of the silence that had been my only companion for the last year. And I heard Martha's voice in my head, as clear as if she were standing beside me, whispering, "You can't just stand there, Silas. You can't." Before I knew what I was doing, my feet were moving. I didn't push or shove. I just walked, and the crowd seemed to sense something in my silence, parting for me as I reached the edge of the circle. Jedediah's eyes, bloodshot and greedy, landed on me. "Well, look here," the quiet man speaks. "Got $1 for me, Silas?" I didn't answer him. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing past the small list of supplies I'd come for. I pulled out what I had. 3 silver coins. It wasn't much. It wasn't $1. It was barely enough for a sack of oats. I held them out on my calloused palm. "Easy," Jedediah scoffed. "That ain't $1." My other hand went to my ring finger. The worn gold was smooth, a familiar weight I'd worn for 10 years. It was the last piece of Martha I had left. Her name was engraved on the inside, a secret I traced with my thumb every night. Giving it away felt like a betrayal, like cutting off the last limb of my past. But as I looked at Elara's stoic face and the terror in her little boy's eyes, I knew my past was already gone. This was the present. Way. I twisted the ring off my finger. The cold air hit the bare skin, and a hollow ache echoed in my chest. I placed the gold band on top of the silver coins. "This," I said, my voice rough from disuse, "is worth more than $1." Jedediah's eyes widened. He lunged forward, snatching the ring from my palm, ignoring the coins that clattered to the muddy ground. He inspected the gold, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Done," he grunted, stuffing the ring into his pocket as if he feared I'd change my mind. The deal was made. The shame of it hung heavy in the air. I didn't look at Jedediah again. I turned my gaze to Elara. For the first time she looked directly at me, and in her eyes I saw not gratitude, but a deep, questioning caution. I gave a short, sharp nod toward the edge of town. "Come," was all I said. Wordlessly, she took her son's hand, her dignity a cloak around her shoulders. She stepped off the platform, leaving her husband to the judgment of the wind, and followed me away from the square. The crowd watched us go in a stunned, guilty silence as I led my new, broken family toward my old, weathered wagon. The journey out of town was a symphony of silence, punctuated only by the groan of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clop of my old horse, Bartholomew. The boy, Leo, had fallen asleep almost instantly, his small body curled into his mother's side like a fern frond. Elara herself sat as still as a stone carving, her hands still resting protectively over her belly. She watched the rugged landscape roll by, the hard lines of her face unreadable. I didn't press her for words. I figured she'd used up all she had for a lifetime just by surviving the day. The weight in the back of my wagon felt different. For a year it had carried only supplies, tools, and the heavy burden of my own solitude. Now it carried life, fragile and uncertain. It felt heavier, and yet somehow the wagon rolled easier. As the last grimy buildings of the town disappeared behind us, her voice, low and rough, cut through the quiet. Why? It was just one word, but it held 1,000 questions. Why me? What do you want? What kind of man are you? I kept my eyes on the road ahead, on the familiar ruts that led home. A dozen answers came to mind, that it was what Martha would have wanted, that I couldn't stand the look in her husband's eyes, that I was a fool with nothing left to lose. But none of them felt true enough. They felt like excuses. "Didn't feel right leaving you there," I said finally. The words were plain, unadorned, like the land around us. It was the simplest truth I had. She didn't reply, but I saw her shoulders relax, just a fraction. It was enough. We arrived at my cabin as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the sky. It's not much to look at. Just a small, solid box of logs I built with my own 2 hands, smoke curling from its stone chimney. It's isolated, tucked away in a shallow valley where the wind doesn't bite quite so hard. To most, it would look like the loneliest place on earth. To me, it was a fortress. For the first time in a long while, I was bringing someone inside its walls. Etreated. I pulled the wagon to a halt and hopped down. "We're here." Elara gently woke her son, murmuring something soft in his ear. She slid down from the wagon, her movements stiff but sure, and helped Leo to the ground. He blinked at the little cabin, his eyes wide in the fading light. Inside, I lit the lantern and stirred the embers in the hearth, adding fresh logs until a proper fire was crackling, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin was one room, dominated by the stone fireplace, a sturdy table, and a rope bed in the corner. It was sparse, but it was clean and warm. It was a shelter. "The bed is yours," I said, gesturing toward it. "You and the boy. It's the warmest spot." I laid my own bedroll near the door. "I expect nothing from you," I added, my voice low so as not to spook her. "No debt, no obligation. This is just a safe place to land. That's all." She watched me, her gaze intense, searching for the lie behind the words. When she seemed to find none, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. She led Leo to the bed, pulled off his worn boots, and tucked him under the thick quilt Martha had made. She didn't get in herself, instead choosing to sit in the chair by the fire, her back ramrod straight, a sentinel watching over her sleeping child. Hours passed. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside, but in here, it was still. I lay on my bedroll, feigning sleep, but my mind was a churning sea. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of breath, of presence. It was louder than any noise. Finally, unable to bear the pretense, I sat up. I found her still awake, staring into the flames as I had been. Her profile was etched in firelight, a study in exhaustion and strength. She didn't seem surprised to see me awake. "You gave him your wedding ring," she said. It wasn't a question. I looked at my bare hand, the pale strip of skin where the gold used to be. It was all I had of value. "She must have been a good woman," Elara whispered, her eyes still on the fire. A lump formed in my throat, hard and familiar. "She was," I managed to say. "Her name was Martha. Lost her to a fever just over a year ago. That ring, it was hers. Seemed wrong to keep it sitting on my finger when it could buy someone's safety. She would have given it away herself." A quiet understanding passed between us in the flickering light. She knew grief. I could see it in the way she held herself, in the deep-set weariness of her soul. She looked at me then, her guard down for just a second. "Martha," she repeated softly. "It's a good name." In the warmth of the fire, sheltered from the wind, it felt like the first real conversation I'd had in a year. And it wasn't with a ghost. I woke to a world gone silent. The wind had finally tired itself out, and in its place, a soft, heavy snow was falling, blanketing the landscape in a thick layer of white. It drifted down in fat, lazy flakes, clinging to the pine boughs and muffling the world until the only sound was the gentle hiss of it against the window pane. The snow isolated us completely, cutting us off from the town and everything beyond. The cabin, once my lonely fortress, now felt like the only solid thing in a disappearing world. I moved quietly, stoking the fire before starting on breakfast. The smell of wood smoke and hot coffee soon mingled with the scent of baking cornbread. It was a simple, comforting smell, one that hadn't filled this small room in a long time. When it was done, I cut 2 thick, steaming slices and set them on the table with a bit of molasses. Elara was already awake, watching me with those cautious eyes. She woke Leo gently, and the boy, still drowsy with sleep, ate his cornbread with a quiet reverence, as if it were the finest cake he'd ever tasted. After he'd finished, his curiosity got the better of him. He slid off his chair and began to explore the corners of the cabin. My heart gave a painful lurch when his eyes landed on the small wooden horse sitting on the mantelpiece. It was crudely carved, its paint chipped, one ear slightly shorter than the other. I had carved it myself, for a child who never got to hold it. Leo reached for it with a tentative hand, his eyes flicking to me for permission. I couldn't speak. I just gave a stiff nod. A part of me wanted to snatch it away, to put it back in the dark chest where it belonged with all the other ghosts. But I watched as his small fingers wrapped around the wood, and a strange thing happened. The horse didn't seem so sad anymore. It just looked like a toy, waiting to be played with. Leo galloped it across the floorboards, making quiet, breathy sounds. Elara shot me a look, a silent apology in her eyes. She had seen the flicker of pain on my face, the way my hands had clenched at my sides. I just shook my head slightly, hoping she understood. The day passed in that quiet, snowbound rhythm. That night, the storm inside the cabin finally broke. It started with a whimper from the corner bed. Leo was crying in his sleep, his small body tense beneath the quilt. Elara was there in an instant, her voice a low, soothing lullaby. "Shh, my love, you're safe. Mama's here." She held him until the tremors subsided and he drifted back into a peaceful sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, her shoulders slumped. When she finally turned back to the fire, her face was a mask of grief. "He has nightmares sometimes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Since she didn't have to finish. I cleared my throat, the words feeling like stones I had to pull up from a deep well. "That horse he was playing with," I began, my gaze fixed on the toy, which Leo had left by the hearth. "I carved it for my daughter, Susanna." Elara looked at me, her full attention snapping into focus. "She was our first," I continued, the story tumbling out before I could stop it. "Born too soon and left too soon. We only had her for 2 days. Martha, she never fully recovered. Not really." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a shared, terrible knowledge. Elara hugged her arms around herself, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "I lost one too," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "A little girl. It was a hard winter, and she caught a fever. Jedediah, he said it was my fault, that I was careless. He never let me forget it. The cruelty of it stole my breath." My grief for Susanna was a clean, sharp pain, born of love and loss. Hers was tangled up in blame and violence, a wound that had been salted every day. We were two people who had stood on the edge of the same abyss, but I had been held by a loving hand, while she had been pushed. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the defiance and the resilience to the shattered heart beneath. My own chest ached in sympathy. After Martha and Susanna were gone, I admitted, the confession raw and honest, I told myself I was done. I swore I'd never let another soul into this cabin. I'd live out my days with the silence. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Elara watched me, her expression soft with a sorrow that mirrored my own. She glanced at her sleeping son, then back at the fire, at the small wooden horse resting by the hearth. "And yet," she said quietly, her voice cutting through my self-pity with simple, undeniable truth, "here we are." The snow eventually gave way to a grudging thaw, and the days settled into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a slowly beating heart. It was a rhythm built of small sounds, the scrape of my chair against the floorboards in the morning, the whisk of Elara's broom as she swept the hearth, the soft thud of Leo's wooden horse on the floor. For the first time in a year, the silence in my cabin wasn't empty, it was filled with purpose. Afkara. One afternoon, as I was mending a piece of harness by the fire, Elara began to hum. It was a low, melodic tune, a lullaby, I reckoned. I stopped my work, my hands still, the needle poised in mid-air. I just listened. The sound curled into the corners of the room, weaving itself into the scent of wood smoke and leather. It was a sound of peace, something I thought my home would never know again. When she trailed off, I didn't say a word. I just picked my needle back up and continued my work, but the tune stayed with me. Later that week, I found Leo watching me chop wood. I set down my axe and told him a story Martha used to tell about a little star who was afraid of the dark. His eyes were wide and serious, and when I finished, he gave me a solemn nod, as if I had just imparted some great and ancient wisdom. These moments of softness began to add up, building something fragile between us. I could see it worried her. One evening, as we sat at the table shelling beans, she spoke into the comfortable quiet. "I'm afraid of this," she said, not looking at me. "Afraid of what?" I asked, my hands pausing over the bowl. "This," she gestured vaguely around the warm, firelit room. "The quiet, the warmth. I'm afraid of getting soft." Her knuckles were white, where she gripped the bean pods. "Hardness is what kept me and Leo alive. It's all I've had to protect us. If I lose it..." I thought about that for a long moment. I looked at her, at the fierce, guarded set of her jaw and the deep well of strength in her eyes. "You're not hard, Elara," I said quietly. "You're strong. There's a difference. Hard things, they shatter when they're hit right. Strong things bend. They endure." I pushed the bowl of shelled beans toward her. "You don't have to be hard to survive. Sometimes, you just have to be willing to hold on." Her fear was palpable, a third presence in the room. And later that night, the sky seemed to answer it. A storm rolled in from the west, a churning mass of black clouds that swallowed the stars. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and rain began to lash against the cabin in angry sheets. A deep roll of thunder shook the very logs of the walls, and Leo let out a small cry from the bed. Elara was with him in a second, a comforting shadow in the dark. The storm raged on, a wild thing tearing at our small sanctuary. When Leo was settled again, she and I sat across from each other by the fire, the storm a symphony of chaos outside. "This cabin," I said, looking into the flames. It was so quiet for so long. After Martha, I thought I'd go mad from it. It felt like it was waiting for sound again. "I'm sorry for all the noise we've brought," she replied, her voice barely audible over a clap of thunder. I shook my head, a lump forming in my throat. I had to tell her. She had to understand. "Elara," I said, meeting her gaze across the flickering firelight. "You and the boy, you aren't just noise." I took a breath, the words feeling momentous, like a vow. "You're the reason it breathes at all." Her eyes widened, a storm of emotions passing through them. Disbelief, fear, and something else, something fragile and hopeful. The thunder finally subsided, leaving behind the gentle drumming of rain on the roof. In the renewed quiet, a small voice piped up from the corner. "Mama?" It was Leo, his voice sleepy but clear. "Are we a family now?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastatingly complex. I saw the panic flash in Elara's eyes. She was not ready for that word. "No, sweet boy," she whispered, her voice strained. "We're just staying with Mr. Silas for a while. Go back to sleep." I didn't say a thing. I rose from my chair, walked over to the bed, and gently tucked the quilt around Leo's small shoulders. I rested my hand on his head for a second, a silent answer to his question. When I turned back, Elara was watching me, her face unreadable, but I knew she had understood the gesture. Words could be denied. Actions could not. The great thaw came in earnest, turning the snow-covered world to mud and memory. The air softened, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of new life. I watched the first stubborn crocuses push their way through the cold ground near the cabin steps, small, defiant splashes of purple against the bleak landscape. They reminded me of Elara. She had begun to thaw, too. The rigid line of her shoulders had softened, and sometimes a rare, fleeting smile would touch her lips when Leo said something particularly profound, as only a child can. She moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose, her presence now as integral to the space as the hearthstone. One afternoon I was out sharpening the blade of my plow, preparing for the spring planting. Elara came to stand on the porch, watching me work, her arms wrapped around her swollen belly. The sun caught the glints of red in her brown hair. "You've never asked," she said, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. I didn't stop my work, just kept the steady, rhythmic scrape of the whetstone against the steel. "Asked what?" "About him. About why I stayed so long." I paused, setting the stone down. I looked up at her, at the strength and sorrow etched into her beautiful face. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. When you were ready." She was ready. She walked down the steps and sat on a nearby log, her hands folded in her lap. And she told me. She spoke of meeting Jedediah when she was just a girl, how his swagger and promises had seemed like a way out of her own poor, loveless home. She told me how she thought she could fix the anger in him, that her love could soothe the wild beast that lived just beneath his skin. Her voice grew quiet and raw as she spoke of how the beast had turned on her, his cruelty escalating with every passing year. She spoke of the loss of their second child, the little girl she'd mourned alone, while Jedediah had thrown her grief back in her face like a curse. She told me how he'd started drinking more heavily, how the farm had failed, and how his desperation had finally curdled into the monstrous act I'd witnessed in the town square. "I didn't know how to leave," she finished, her gaze fixed on the muddy ground. "He made me believe I had nowhere to go, that no one would want me, especially not like this." She patted her belly. "I stayed for Leo. I thought I was protecting him. But I was just teaching him how to endure a cage." I listened to every word, my own heart, a dull, heavy ache in my chest. When she was done, a heavy silence settled between us. I put the plow blade aside, wiped my hands on my trousers, and went to sit on the log beside her. "Elara," I said, my voice thick, "you are the strongest person I have ever met." She flinched, as if expecting a blow. I was a fool. No, I insisted, turning to face her. You were a survivor. And you did more than survive. You kept your heart from turning to stone. You kept that boy's spirit safe. I thought of Martha, of her gentle nature and easy smiles. When I lost my wife, I thought if I ever let anyone in again, it would have to be someone soft, someone who hadn't been touched by the ugliness of the world. I met her eyes, wanting her to see the truth of what I was about to say. But I was wrong. I didn't want someone softer. I think, all along, my soul was waiting for truth. And you are the truest person I know. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Before either of us could say more, the sound of an approaching horse broke the spell. It was our neighbor from the next valley over, Mr. Abernathy. A good man, but a notorious gossip. He was holding a letter. "Silas," he said, his face grim as he dismounted. "This came for you from the sheriff's office." He handed me the envelope, his eyes darting from me to Elara and her pregnant belly, his mind clearly working overtime. "There's talk in town. Jedediah has filed a formal complaint. Says you stole his wife." My blood ran cold. I tore open the letter. The legal words were a tangled mess, but the meaning was brutally clear. Jedediah was petitioning the town council. He was claiming Elara was an unfit mother, living in sin with another man. He was demanding they take Leo away from her and place him in the county orphanage. The coming storm wasn't one of rain and thunder. It was one of law and men, and it was heading straight for our door. The sheriff's letter lay on the table between us, a stark white rectangle of malice in the warm lamplight. Abernathy had long since departed, leaving a cloud of dread in his wake. The words on the page felt like a brand on my soul. Unfit mother, living in sin, petition to remove the child. Jedediah wasn't just trying to reclaim what he saw as his property. He was trying to destroy Elara from the inside out, using her own child as the weapon. The silence in the cabin was the heaviest it had ever been. Leo was asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around him. Elara stood by the window, staring out into the darkness as if she could see Jedediah's malice creeping over the hills. Her back was rigid, the posture of a soldier bracing for impact. I saw the hardness she had feared losing return to her, settling over her like a shroud. "I have to go," she said finally, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She turned from the window, her face a pale, determined mask. "Tonight, while he's sleeping." "Go where?" I asked, my own voice rough with a rising panic. "Elara, you can't just run, not in your condition. Where would you go?" "It doesn't matter," she shot back, her eyes flashing with a desperate fire. "If I'm gone, the complaint means nothing. They'll have no reason to take him. You could tell them you took him in. You could claim guardianship. They'll see you as a decent man, a widower giving a poor boy a home. He'd be safe here, with you." Her words hit me like a physical blow. She was willing to tear herself apart, to vanish into the wilderness alone and pregnant, just to ensure her son's safety. She was offering to sacrifice herself on the altar of my good name. The thought was unbearable. It was a transaction of shame all over again, and I would not allow it. "No," I said, the word sharp and absolute. I crossed the room and stood before her, blocking her path to the door, to the darkness. "I won't let you do that. We are not losing you to save a piece of you. That's not a victory." "You don't have a choice, Silas." "It's the only way," she cried, her voice cracking, the mask finally crumbling to reveal the terror beneath. "There's another way," I said, my heart pounding a frantic, powerful rhythm against my ribs. My mind was suddenly clear, the path ahead illuminated as if by a bolt of lightning. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a bedrock of certainty. I reached into the small pouch on my belt where I kept oddments, a spare button, a bit of twine, a lucky coin. My fingers closed around a small, humble object I had braided together during the long, quiet nights, my hands needing something to do while my mind replayed the sound of her humming. I pulled it out. Sign, it was a ring, not of gold, but of silver birch twigs, carefully woven together with a thread of dark wood from a fallen oak branch. It was a thing of the forest, of the cabin itself, simple, strong, and true. I held it out to her. Her eyes fell to the ring, her breath catching in her throat. "Marry me, Elara," I said, the words feeling more right than any I had ever spoken. Not just to save Leo, not just to satisfy the law. Marry me because this cabin, this life, it was just a place until you came. Now it's a home. My voice dropped to a whisper, raw with a truth that stunned me even as I spoke it. I feel like I already belonged to you from the moment I saw you on that platform. Tears streamed down her face, silent and glistening in the lamplight. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. She just stared at the simple, wooden ring, as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. The decision was sealed by a sleepy voice from the corner. "Mama?" Leo was sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. He had heard the emotion in our voices. He looked from his mother's tear-streaked face to my outstretched hand. Then, with an instinct more pure and true than any law, he scrambled out of bed, ran across the floor, and wrapped his small arms around my leg, holding on tight. That was it. That was the only answer that mattered. Elara let out a sob, a sound of such profound relief it was almost painful to hear. She nodded, a jerky, desperate motion. The next morning we rode to town. We didn't sneak or hide. We rode straight to the magistrate's office, Elara on Bartholomew's back, Leo sitting proudly in front of me. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by a bemused clerk and the dusty law books that lined the walls. But when the magistrate pronounced us man and wife, a peace settled over me, deep and unshakable. Back at the cabin, the tension finally broke. Elara sat at the table and wept, not with fear or sorrow, but with the bone-deep relief of a soldier who had finally been told the war was over. I knelt beside her, taking her hand in mine. "You healed a part of me I thought was buried forever, Silas," she whispered through her tears. "And you," I said, my thumb tracing the grain of the wooden ring now on her finger, "you taught it how to breathe again." Spring deepened into summer, and life in the cabin found a new, more permanent rhythm. Our marriage wasn't one of grand romance, but of quiet, steady partnership. It was in the way she'd have a hot cup of coffee waiting for me when I came in from the fields, and in the way I'd carve a new animal for Leo's growing wooden menagerie. Love, I was learning, didn't always shout. Sometimes it was a shared silence, a knowing glance, the comfort of another's presence in a quiet room. Elara's belly grew round and full, a promise of the new life that was coming, a life conceived in hardship but destined for safety. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a cautious optimism, a hope so fragile it was breathtaking to behold. The baby decided to arrive on a night much like the one when our strange journey had begun, with a storm. The sky, which had been clear and starry just hours before, turned a bruised purple. The wind rose to a furious howl, and rain began to fall in heavy, driving sheets. It was as if the world outside was in turmoil, mirroring the momentous event unfolding within our four walls. Elara's labor was hard and fast. I'd sent for the midwife in the next valley at the first sign, but one look at the raging storm told me she wouldn't make it in time. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up my throat. I had only ever known birth to be a precursor to death. The memory of Susanna, so small and fragile, haunted the edges of my mind. But then I looked at Elara. Her face was slick with sweat, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of the bed, but her eyes were filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. She was not the same woman who had stood on that auction block. She was a force of nature in her own right, and she wasn't afraid. Her courage chased my own fear away. "Stay with me, Silas," she panted between contractions, her voice strained but firm. "Don't you dare leave." "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, my voice steadier than I felt. I wiped her brow with a cool cloth, my hand surprisingly steady. I held her hand, whispering the soothing words Martha's mother had once whispered to her. I became her anchor in the storm, refusing to let her be swept away by the pain. In those dark, desperate hours, we were not a widower and a bought woman. We were a husband and a wife, fighting together for our family. Just as the storm reached its peak with a clap of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin, the baby came. With a final, guttural cry from Elara, a new life entered the world. A girl. She was tiny, her cry more of a thin wail than a robust scream, but she was breathing. She was alive. I carefully cleaned her and wrapped her in the softest blanket we owned. My hands, usually clumsy with anything so delicate, moved with a newfound reverence. I brought her to Elara, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. "A daughter," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Elara reached for her, tears of exhaustion and joy streaming down her face. "She's so small," she breathed, stroking the baby's downy hair. "She's small," I agreed, my gaze fixed on the perfect tiny child. "But she's not broken. Just like her mother." A look of profound, unconditional love passed between us, a love forged in the fires of shared hardship and sealed in this moment of miraculous creation. We named her Clara, a name that felt like light and clarity. The storm outside began to recede, its fury spent. But another was at our door. A hard, insistent knocking startled us both. I laid a protective hand on Elara's shoulder and went to the door. "Kugthamen." Two men stood on the porch, their coats dripping. Lawmen. I recognized one as the deputy from town. "Silas," the deputy said, his tone officious and cold. "We're here on behalf of Jedediah Croft. He's filed a claim, and we've come to investigate the living situation of the boy Leo. A year ago, I would have shrunk back. I would have been the quiet man, intimidated by the law. But I was not that man anymore. I was a husband and a father. This cabin was not my fortress of solitude. It was my family's home." I drew myself up to my full height, blocking the doorway. My voice, when I spoke, held a strength I didn't know I possessed. It was the voice of a man with everything to protect. "There's nothing to investigate," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "This ain't a house of sin. This is a home. My wife has just given birth to my daughter. My son is sleeping safely in his bed." I looked them dead in the eye, my gaze as hard and unyielding as granite. "You will not tear it apart. Now get off my land." The men stared at me, taken aback by the fierce authority in my voice. They glanced past me, catching a glimpse of Elara in the bed, holding our newborn daughter, the scene a portrait of domestic peace. They saw the truth. Defeated, they tipped their hats, turned without another word, and disappeared into the rain-soaked dawn. I had faced the storm and I had won. Word of the lawman's visit and my refusal to bend spread through the valley faster than a spring wildfire. But it wasn't the gossip I had feared. When I next rode into town for supplies, the stares were different. The whispers were no longer laced with judgment, but with a grudging respect. They saw me not as the quiet, reclusive widower, but as a man who stood for his family. They saw the quiet strength in Elara when she accompanied me, Clara strapped to her chest, and the happy, untroubled light in Leo's eyes. Our little family, forged in a storm of shame and desperation, had become an undeniable truth. The town had no choice but to accept it. Our cabin transformed. The one-room shelter that had once been a vessel for my grief was now overflowing with life. The silence was gone, replaced by the happy gurgles of a baby, the thud of Leo's wooden toys, and the sound of Elara's humming, which had become the constant, gentle soundtrack to our days. I added a new room onto the side of the cabin, my hammer blows ringing out with purpose. Every beam I set, every nail I drove, felt like a line in a love letter I was writing to my new life. It was no longer just a house. It was a home, breathing and expanding with the love it contained. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Elara and I sat on the porch steps, watching Leo teach a clumsy, laughing Clara how to pat the nose of our old horse, Bartholomew. "I love you, Silas," Elara said, her voice soft in the twilight. She didn't say it with flowery words or grand pronouncements. She said it like a simple fact, like stating that the sky was blue or the grass was green. It was a truth that had grown between us, quiet and steady, nurtured by shared burdens and small kindnesses. I reached for her hand, my calloused fingers lacing through hers. The feel of her skin against mine was more real than any memory. "I love you too, Elara," I replied, the words feeling like they had been waiting in my heart for a lifetime. "You and the children, you didn't just fill the silence, you gave me a reason to listen again." Her hand tightened in mine, a silent promise of a shared future. We had found our own language of love, one that didn't need elaborate translation. It was in the way I'd bring her a wildflower from the field, and the way she'd save me the last piece of pie. It was in the quiet understanding that passed between us as we tucked our children into bed each night. We had healed each other, not by trying to fix what was broken, but by building something new and whole from the pieces. "We should plant a tree," she said, her gaze on the children. "Right here, an apple tree to mark this place." Her eyes met mine, and I saw the depth of her meaning. To mark the spot where something broken learned to live again. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. An apple tree. A symbol of sustenance, of patience, of a future that would bear fruit for generations. It was perfect. I stood and pulled her to her feet. The last rays of sunlight bathed her face in a warm, ethereal glow. Leo and Clara were giggling by the fence, their laughter a sweet melody on the evening air. For so long, I had only known passion as a memory, a ghost of a life I once had. But this was different. This was a love that was present, real, and breathing. I leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion or sudden discovery. It was a kiss of knowing. It tasted of wood smoke and fresh-baked bread and the undeniable truth of home. It was a quiet confirmation of everything we had built together, a seal on the family we had forged. With our children as our witnesses, under the vast, open sky, we fully embraced our new beginning. We had learned that a home isn't just built with logs and nails, but with mercy and courage. And that sometimes, the greatest love doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm, but walks in quietly, takes off its coat, and decides to stay.